Let's talk about sex, sisters, in perimenopause specifically. The most common and uncommon struggles for women in their sex lives, how our hormones play a role in this, and how to move from sexual frustration to a thriving sex life. Let's dive in.
What's up, sister? Welcome back to the Period Whisperer podcast, the show helping perimenopause and menopause women de-stress your body and decode what it's saying to you so you can own your own health, energy, and weight loss again. If you're new, I'm so happy you're here. I'm Bria. I'm your host, a recovering people pleaser and hustle addict turned functional and holistic hormone specialist. Let's lean in and learn what your body is saying to you.
Hey there, sister. Welcome back to one of our guest expert interviews on the Period Whisperer podcast. And I think it was high time that we start talking about sex again here on the podcast. I know for years I heard women talk about how they lost their libido, weren't that interested. But what I have learned as a hormone expert in perimenopause, after looking at thousands of women's hormones, is that this can be an amazing time for us to have juicy, beautiful, put the shame at the door kind of sex. So my guest today is Chloe Mascard. We had an incredible conversation. She is a sex expert or a sex intimacy expert. And she comes and joins us. We talk everything about shame, about performative sex, about the most common and uncommon struggles, about how to really have a juicy, thriving sex life. She has amazing bite-sized sex and intimacy tips for all of us busy women out there. And I think you're going to love her energy, the tips that she brings to the table, and just this overall juicy conversation. So meet Chloe. Well, hey there, sisters. Welcome back to the Period Whisperer podcast. We have a juicy topic and a wonderful guest today. So welcome, Chloe, to the Period Whisperer podcast. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, it is. And pleasure is on the table today, which is kind of exciting. So let's start with you. I already talked about your intro a little, but I always really love to understand where people come from and how they become passionate about what they're doing. So how did you become passionate about education on sex and intimacy?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting one. People say, is this something you always wanted to do? And it's obviously not. But
child, no.
Yeah. Well, that leads me into my story, actually. I've always been a really curious person, not necessarily just on sex and intimacy, but just in general. And I think, I really love to explore and understand things by experiencing them myself. And we go through those years of exploration with our bodies and our sexuality as we're going into our teenage years. And I realized that very quickly that in particular as a woman during those times, that it was quite shameful to embrace our sexuality and to even talk about sex openly at home. It just wasn't a thing for me and not for many other people that I've spoken to about it either.
Yeah.
So when I went through those teenage years and, we lean into experimentation, understanding our bodies and our sexuality, I formed a belief in my head and a story that it's my role to please my partner and that my pleasure isn't important. And I think it's places like movies and porn that I learnt those stories. And that was really the only reference that I had growing up of what sex looked like, because it really wasn't discussed anywhere else. And I think for me that started, and for most people, started this quite bad pattern of pretending to enjoy the encounters as opposed to really dropping into my pleasure and experiencing it in my body. And I didn't learn how to share my needs and desires in that space either. And only really when I was asked, would I feel comfortable to express that I was enjoying something. And even then, most of the time, I would lie. So it didn't feel like it was a space, like I was, playing this kind of game where I was feeling the need to present in a certain way for somebody else's pleasure, when really the curiosity and desire within me was still there.
Yeah.
So now as a professional in the space, I realize that power of communication, like open communication. And I think that realizing that there was so many ways that we could improve pleasure for women.
Yeah.
And by having that self-awareness in my journey and then helping other women transform their intimate relationships, with it being simple, like it didn't need to be complicated. And I think for me, understanding that there were some tweaks that we could make in order for people to have a deeper level of connection with their partner and with themselves, it seemed like a no-brainer for me to step into the space. So
yeah, it was amazing. I mean, even just hearing you recount your story, I mean, I can recognize so much of what you say as truth for myself, for sure. Like even like I remember as a tween, I remember seeing television shows where they're addressing like masturbation, but it was always for boys. Like it was never
yeah,
talked about for girls. So it was like it just didn't exist. So that's where that is that where that you're talking about, is that where that sort of shame piece kind of originally comes in? Is that it's just not even on the table? Like nobody even discusses it?
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it was like in, on the other side of the world in terms of like when you grew up, if your
Yeah.
family or sex was talked about in general. But yeah, on TV it was very, very minimal, and if anything, just for boys. And yeah, at home and school, as well. It was more like the solution to not getting pregnant and not getting an STD or an STI is abstinence.
Mm.
Not really going to work. If anything, for the rebellious folk, it would be like, well, now I want to do it more because I've been told I can't.
Yeah.
So,
That's interesting.
pleasure and consent just never came into the mix.
Yeah, it is so interesting. So obviously, like there's one piece of the puzzle that kind of comes in, right? Where it's like, okay, well, it's not even a discussion around like, women even having pleasure or taking time to find
Yeah.
the pleasure, unless I guess you have parents who maybe are going to talk openly about it. I certainly did not have parents like that were going to talk about it. But then, the other piece you said that kind of hit home for me was just this, I felt like it was my responsibility for my partner's pleasure. And
Yes.
like, where do you think that comes from?
Everywhere.
Sorry, everywhere.
I honestly think it's got better, but like I think, and I know that I'm not sure how old you are, but I feel like we're maybe similar age.
42.
I think, okay, yeah, I'm 37. So similar demographic. I feel like I didn't have the internet on my phone when I was in school.
Sure, that's true.
Things like that. So I think movies growing up was where the story kind of started, I was kind of it was performative, I think. So it's like I need to mirror what's going on. And if I'm not experiencing pleasure, then there's something wrong with me. So I need to play a role, and that on movies, it's like all of a sudden it's hot and heavy. And then 3 seconds later, the woman's orgasming or like enjoying herself. And I'm like, that's just one, there's no warm up and no, foreplay. Yeah. And two, majority of women don't orgasm from sex.
Yeah.
So just sex alone, like they need other stimulation. So that was just for me not setting me up and many of us up for, prioritizing our pleasure.
Absolutely not. I think it's super confusing. It can be really oppressive for people who are trying to discover their sexuality as well, to know like whether what's even right is right for them, if we don't even know how to find that piece. So what kind of struggles do you see most commonly for women around having a thriving sex life?
Yeah, it's interesting. I gave this a little bit of thought, but and I bang on about this all the time, but it's so important. Communication or lack of communication. It's that one simple thing that, if we were able to find a way, and this is what I support a lot of clients with, to be able to understand ourselves and understand what we want and what brings us pleasure, and then communicate it with our partner, then I believe that would have a huge impact. So a lot of women find it really challenging to obviously express their needs and desires, and boundaries as well is another one. But the lack of communication often leads to dissatisfaction and frustration in our sex lives. And I think when we're talking about dissatisfaction and frustration, a lot of the time that stems from not saying anything and just hoping that the person's going to all of a sudden find the spot or find a way to pleasure them, even if they, they don't know within themselves what it is that brings them pleasure.
Yeah.
Another major challenge that I have clients come to me with is body image and self-esteem, and not feeling comfortable in their own skin. And it really does affect their ability to engage and really enjoy intimacy and pleasure.
To let go.
So that's
right.
Pardon?
To let go, like to kind of be able to be really vulnerable, I think, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then it's, that constant in the mind, worrying about how their body looks, worrying about, do I look good enough? Shouldn't have eaten that, sandwich at lunch or the pasta for dinner, or, this negative self-talk. And we can often as women get really in our head.
Yeah.
And so there's this, as soon as there's this negative story in our head about our body, how do I look? Should I turn the lights off? Does he find this attractive? Like, a lot of it is just chatter in the mind, and that can shut down that part of our body that also experiences pleasure and arousal. So that can be a challenge.
Do you see, this is totally off topic, I know we didn't, but do you see similar struggles in same-sex couples as you do in hetero couples?
Oh, good question. Communication, yes.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's true.
Body image, not as much.
Yeah.
Interesting you say that. I think there's a level of understanding if we're talking about, a female-female relationship. I think there's a level of understanding there, and a level of ability to support in a very soft and emotional way of understanding. I think that definitely helps in the way of body image. But look, I recently had a throuple come to me, and I was, very excited about the opportunity to work with, a throuple. It's great. But their challenge was around not prioritizing intimacy. So the same, there's varying relationships these days, but it's often, low libido, I don't have desire for intimacy, things along those lines, no matter what the sex or gender or identifying person is.
Yeah. So, okay. So some of the most common things, and I can completely see where this would come from, is lack of communication. And part of that you're saying is like lack of obviously knowing, like it's hard to even communicate if we don't even know what we want for ourselves.
Right.
And then the other piece of that is really that the body image issues and as well. That's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Are there any uncommon struggles that you hear come up, or less, that are, that you don't hear very often, but are very real?
Yeah, absolutely. You would think this one would be more common than it is, but there's often a disconnect from our sexual identity and desires. And this often stems from, maybe religious upbringings or inability to tap into that part of ourselves, where in some cultures women haven't had the opportunity to, or freedom to, explore their own sexuality, and it leads to like a lack of understanding about what actually brings them pleasure. That cultural and societal expectations can create an immense amount of guilt and shame for sexual desires. And the part where it's quite uncommon is when clients will come to me and they've never given themselves permission to experiencing pleasure or their sexuality. And that's, that happens. It is a thing.
Yeah, I can absolutely see where that would come into play. So interesting. And I think it's so good that we talk about it. I love the work that you do. And it's obviously so important because, even as we talk about it, there is a stigma around this stuff. And yet there shouldn't be, I think. Like, obviously there's private elements to everybody's life, but I think embracing your own sexuality and your own sexual health, like pleasure in general, and this would be part of that, is so critical to our hormones and our stress levels and our overall health of our body. So it's a shame that it's been such as, so stigmatized. So it's really important the work you're doing. I'm super grateful.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. When you think about, so obviously the women listening here are all kind of over 35, like in those hormonally shifting, maybe even into menopause and beyond years. How do you see our hormones, playing into like our sexual health, our sexual desires, our connection with intimacy, in these years?
Yeah, absolutely. So hormones absolutely have a profound impact on our sexual health and desire.
Yeah.
And I think during perimenopause, there's fluctuations in obviously estrogen, progesterone, and those levels can impact our libido. I want to acknowledge as well that there's also, the vaginal dryness and discomfort that can come through with these hormonal changes as well. And it can affect our mood and our energy. And I think understanding the changes in particular during this period of time needs to be normalized. I think there is it's a topic, like we were talking about sex before, that it's actually not taught at all. And it's not readily available to talk about, perimenopause and menopause.
Yeah.
Yet 9.3 million people are currently experiencing menopause. I'm like blown away by that amount of people that are currently experiencing menopause, not to mention how many people will experience menopause, yet
Yeah.
we don't talk about it. And it's another taboo topic that needs to be normalized. But open communication, I'm coming back to that C word again, with partners just around these shifts in hormones, whether they be related to what we've just spoken about or not, is really essential for maintaining intimacy and connection with your partner. You've really got to be able to talk about these things, so that there's not this tiptoeing around and, you're not feeling like intimacy or sex. And then your partner's just not aware and is taking it personally, and then there becomes another layer of difficulty in the relationship. So, and that I often work with clients on actual scripts of how they can communicate, because we're not taught how to communicate with our partner in relationships, really, let alone about sex. So, I personally have experienced hormonal changes and challenges, whilst it wasn't directly correlated to perimenopause and menopause. It was a byproduct of really deep unresolved conflict in my relationship. And that stress response in my body was causing my nervous system to be activated and altered my hormones.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm sharing this is because when we look at the hormonal changes in the body and how, these perimenopause and menopause affects us as women, we have to look at the whole picture,
Yeah.
because this is a time in our lives where things are changing internally and externally, but it's also an opportunity to consider, how is that impacting everything in our lives, and where could it potentially have stemmed from that has now the additional stress on top has then, impacted our hormones.
Yeah.
So we need that support from our partners, from our friends, from our family, and most importantly from ourselves. It's important that we dedicate more time to fill up our own cup and bring pleasure into our day.
Yeah.
And I think when we learn how to deeply connect with our body through this period of our lives, or any time that we're having hormonal changes in our body, I think it is really a good thing to consider how well connected you are to your body, because that can play a much bigger role than what we realize.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that I was actually chatting with a doctor friend of mine yesterday about this topic of hormones, because I knew I was going to be on the podcast with you.
Yeah.
And how treating these hormones is simply often in the medical space about treating the symptom.
Yeah.
And in some cases that works and it's great. But the approach I take in, my work and also my personal life is that we've got to consider the whole picture and supporting ourselves holistically.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so incredible that you say that. And it's so important because, like you said, when we think about this time in our life, we're handling a lot. This transition is stressful on the body. And whenever, stress is like being experienced through the limbic system and our cortisol is rising, I mean, reproduction and hormones are being suppressed. So if we're not looking at that whole picture, then we're missing, I think, like the biggest part of the funnel that impacts our hormones, aren't we? Like if we can focus on what is creating the stress. And of course, I feel like working with someone like you is going to help us on that level of maybe the things that are stuck sexually, or those like thoughts that we have, which are really, really important and are going to start to come up because, up until this age, and this is just kind of popped into my mind here, but up until this age, you have a lot more time, a lot more space. You have pregnancy, a lot of women go through. And so there's this kind of buffer around like, oh, well, you don't have to necessarily talk about sex as much because you're trying to have a baby and then you had the baby and nobody has as much time or energy. But we reach this age and we don't necessarily have those demands anymore. And so I think it can start to become glaringly obvious that when there's issues at this point. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed. And I think there's a lot of, when we're younger, distractions, different priorities.
Yeah.
We're slowly starting to create space in our lives and, make a little bit more time for us, or when we probably need to be.
Yeah.
And these things come to the surface, and if we ignore them, they don't go away. And they just continue to just, excuse me, look at me.
Yeah.
You need to address what's going on. And, when you're going through these hormonal changes, and I like that you brought up pregnancy as well, because that's another really challenging part of intimacy and sex, is like how do I identify as a woman having sex with my partner post kids, because that's a whole different thing, because you're going through this change in identity.
Yeah.
And what society believes is, okay and not okay. So, I completely agree with you there.
Yeah. When you have someone, and then I'd like to get back into the mindset piece for sure, but I want to kind of pull out on some of the other aspects of it. But if you have people that are coming to you and they're finding sex painful, what are the next steps, or what is the direction that you point them in at that point?
Yeah, look, pain is definitely it's common in intimacy. And I think on a surface level, there's the real, challenging issues around pain. And I think what we need to identify, and I normally do this in my intake form, so I'll know basically by asking the right questions.
Yeah.
And then having our first call together, is the pain something that is from our mind? Like, is it our body is physically in pain? Is there a problem in our physical body? Or is it our body is reacting to a previous situation, or anticipating that we're going to experience pain, and therefore the body constricts and tightens up? So there's a few different reasons for pain, and it's a tricky one to identify until you speak directly to the client.
Right.
And that's something that we can overcome, absolutely. And I have a beautiful referral base of really amazing people and practitioners in the space, that if it's not something that I can work with a client on, there are so many amazing people that can support those who are experiencing painful sex, because, the first thing we want to do is create a pleasant experience for the client, right?
Yeah. You don't want to go through all that work and then have it just be painful and probably create more trauma, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's go back into the mindset piece, because I think, like, in my practice, I definitely see some challenges with lubrication and, and painful sex. I think that's, it's definitely real, and for many women, but more commonly, as the hormones shift and the demand of this time in life is around, I think the challenge around libido and intimacy really comes into like desire and energy. So if, and we've talked a little bit about communication, maybe we can dive a bit deeper into like what that actually looks like. Maybe you can give us a few examples, but how do we begin to really reignite this part of ourselves when we're feeling tired and exhausted and not sexual and on a daily hamster wheel?
Yeah, I love that you say that we're tired and exhausted, because that's like 100% of my clients. And I've literally built my business around and this will be the podcast as well. It's, focused on time poor women and couples. Yeah. So it's like, we all we have less time in our days and we've got less energy and, it becomes another thing on the to-do list. So I hear that all the time. That's a really common thing. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think when we're coming, we're going to come back to the body and how we can actually start to incorporate some techniques in our body, and also our habits, I think, is another really important thing to talk about as well. It needs to become intimacy in our relationship needs to become more of a priority. And I think a lot of people will just expect that the relationship's going to continue to tick along even if we don't put time and effort into it. And I think, one, there's how we feel in our body and how happy we are as an individual.
Yeah.
And how rested we are and how tired, and overwhelmed we are. And then there's also the effort and time that we're putting into the relationship. So when I work with a client, I'll always focus on the individual first if I'm working with one client. And I think it's really important that we are doing things that fill our cup, whether that be meditation, because it is proven in research that it does help bring us back to our body and in turn improve our sexual desire and arousal because it allows us to tune into our bodies. Or whether it's things like exercise, because that proves to increase the endorphins in the body and naturally increases libido as well. So it's got to start with you. It's got to start with how you're structuring your day and what parts of it are you including in filling your cup.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also that self-discovery piece that we spoke about before as well. And I think when we're engaging in mindful masturbation, which is another taboo conversation, but when we're self-pleasuring, we can actually start to reconnect with our desires and what it is that brings us pleasure. And that may have shifted over time. That may have gone from where it was in the beginning of the relationship or back in our 20s to where we are now. And I think it's really important that we block out that solo time without distractions so that we can start to get to know ourselves better.
Yeah. Is there, sorry, I want to talk about this because I think that,
yeah, of course.
About it. Is there, and I don't think you're going to have a direct answer to this, but when you're starting to explore this part of yourself about like your own sexual pleasure and masturbation again, for people who've maybe clear of it, is it like, I think about like, well, when we're trying to put on muscle, we need to be working out at least twice a week. Like, is there, like, should it be something that we be carving out time for 2 times a week or 3 times a week? Is there a recipe there to start to like kind of rebuild that practice of pleasure?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. You'd be this is like the ultimate client. It's like how many times as opposed to do I have to?
Do I have to?
You know what I mean? Yeah. So you know what? There is no, the more the better.
Yeah.
We don't. Okay. I recently was involved in writing an article on orgasm and pleasure quota, which is really interesting because I've had women come to me and go, well, I've got no libido, I've got no energy, I've got no time, I don't feel like sex. So why would I go and use that up?
Yeah.
Masturbate?
Yeah.
And I'm like, trust me. And they'll go away and they'll, self-pleasure and they'll come back and they'll go, I actually want sex more now. And I'm like, this is what happens. So if you have the ability to and you want to, I encourage the more the merrier. I think it's a beautiful way to connect with yourself, but also, experience pleasure on your own. And once you find what brings you pleasure, bring it back to the relationship. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I did hear someone, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I heard someone talking about how like orgasms and intimacy for women provide energy. It almost creates energy versus for men, it can deplete and it depletes. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah, most people. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for women, sometimes it depends on where they're at in their cycle. And it's really important to address that because that's something we haven't spoken about yet. But where they're at in their cycle, it can deplete energy,
Yeah.
or it can increase energy. And that's unique to the individual. I know for me, majority of the time, I feel more energized.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other times where, you know, I might have pleasure in the evening and I'm ready to sleep straight away.
Yeah, it helps you
So
sleep.
it can be both, but with women, yes, there can be an increase of energy that can happen.
Oh, okay. That's awesome. This is great. And yes, I can't believe we haven't talked about this yet. Can you speak about like what, the opportunities of pleasure in the different phases of our cycle?
Yeah, I love this. So with our cycle, you know, I think a great starting point, obviously, as I'm sure you've spoken about before, is around tracking it. So I think just understanding and, you know, even journaling about our emotions and feelings that come up throughout our cycle is an unbelievable way to get to know our body on a deeper level and our emotions. And you know what's really interesting, I've discovered through my own experience with this is I didn't really think I had much of a fluctuation in my mood, in my self-criticism, in my body image. And then I started to journal based on my cycle and I went, holy shit. It's like clockwork. It's like on this particular week of the cycle, the negative stories are there, the self-criticism is there, and
Right.
it's you know, even finding myself leaning into conflict with my partner,
Yeah.
and I'm like, that's not me, but it's like more things piss me off
Yeah.
during that part. And to be honest, that particular part of my cycle, it's harder for me to want intimacy with my partner. Okay, let me change that. Sex with my partner, because intimacy I want,
Mhm.
sex is different. So yeah, when I'm talking about leaning into sex with my partner. So yeah, I think for me that's been really interesting, and I think when it's very empowering for us to track that and to track, you know, how we feel, what our levels of desire are, and
Mhm.
then we use that data to leverage it and lean into it more, or to find ways that might help increase it when it's a little bit lower.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. No, I think and I think what I hear you saying and what I think is very real is that when we head into those luteal phases, when our hormones are kind of dropping off, I mean, it's just logical, especially when our testosterone, which most women don't realize is our most prominent hormone as women, when it drops off, I mean, things change a little, and especially if we're struggling with progesterone levels, then that like things can get dark in the mind during that phase. So it's not the most, it's a better time for intimacy, isn't it? For like, safety and vulnerability, but less so for maybe for the feeling of wanting to be even touched at that time.
Absolutely. And the thing is with that as well is, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with spontaneous and responsive desire. Have you ever heard of
Oh,
spontaneous
let's hear
and
about
responsive
it.
desire? Okay. So, spontaneous desire is, you know, often at the beginning of a relationship where, you know, or you're turned on and nothing's happened. You might just be turned on because your partner's walking around, you know,
Yeah.
looking hot in their work outfit or whatever. And you're turned on just immediate, like instantly, like it's just spontaneous, it kind of comes upon you. um Responsive desire is, you know, when we're sitting there in the kitchen, we're maybe making something to eat or cooking for our family or, you know, whatever, and our partner comes in and starts doing the dishes and we're like, oh. So it's like
Why
there's
does
like
that turn us on?
all
Why?
the time, all my
Like,
time. I
uh,
knew that was a good example.
it's fascinating, isn't
Yeah,
it? Like,
yeah,
I think when life is full and someone helps you out, you're like, oh, that's nice. That feels good.
definitely.
Like
Hey.
that's so
So
cool.
there's certain things that are, you know, that are slowly starting to build that arousal, but what I suggest in these situations is even, at that point where maybe your partner comes in for a kiss and like leans in and you're initially not turned on, right? You're initially like, I don't know. But then that moment where you start to lean into it and you're like, okay, I'm going to lean in anyway, or I'm going to be intimate with my partner anyway. And then you're aroused.
Yeah.
So that's responsive. So you're responding to the sex or the encounter.
Okay.
And that can often happen where it's like, I don't necessarily have the desire to have sex, but once we start, my body then responds to it. Yeah.
I love that you brought that up, because I do hear that a lot in my clients as well. It's like, I just don't have the initial desire, but once we start, then I'm always happy I did. It's not like I'm regretting it. And so this spontaneous versus the responsive, like, is it common that obviously the amount of spontaneous desire decreases over time in a relationship?
Absolutely. It's quite rare for there to be spontaneous desire from both parties long term. Very unusual. You can create spontaneity and excitement and playfulness in a relationship, and you can bring that in. Just because it's gone doesn't mean it's not there, but it's just how we evolve. It's just what happens. And it's when we understand it, we feel empowered. It's like, okay, now I know that I'm normal, it's okay for me to, not be initially turned on, and that when we start to be intimate, that's when my arousal starts, and that's okay. Like, if that's what it takes to get there, and if then it's empowering for the couple to communicate about that. And find ways to not take it personally and be like, okay, so once we get started, it's something that we're both enjoying. It's just how do you navigate that disparity in spontaneous and responsive desire?
Yeah. So if we want to re-stimulate this, you're saying if we want to create more opportunity, is that through, like just new experiences in general with your partner? Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So doing things that are new, you're kind of activating that part of your brain that is the newness, and you're learning together, doing something that you've both not done before. It's something that's new and exciting. You can also do it where you switch things up, in the bedroom, like, for example, something super minor, like having sex on a different angle of the bed.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
like you might normally have sex without lube.
Yeah.
Maybe have sex with lube, or normally you'll have sex without your underwear on or completely naked. Try having it with maybe some lingerie on, if that's what floats your boat.
Yeah.
Because it's different and it's new. But for the foundation of the relationship, if you can do new hobbies and try new things and go on, this is why holiday sex is a thing.
Yes. Yeah. I was just going to say that. I often will ask my clients when we're talking about libido, it's like, well, when was the last time you went on a vacation? And how was your desire then? I mean, if the desire at that point, we know it's more of this interesting issue with spontaneity versus responsive, you're saying. Because I imagine the responsive is challenging, again, when we're in this stage of handling so much and we're not feeling our best and we're a bit more tired, then it's like, I don't even have the capacity to get to the point where I am going to respond.
Yes. Yeah. And the more we understand ourselves and we connect with ourselves and we know that about ourselves, we'll feel empowered to, maybe call ourselves out and go, oh, okay, is this, could I, for the benefit of myself, because I know that I enjoy this, and for our relationship connection, I know that I'm going to enjoy this when we lean in. So in this moment, does my body need rest, or is the choice for me right now to lean into intimacy, even if it's responsive desire? That's okay. But that's why it's so important that we fill our own cup up first, because when we start to understand ourselves, then we just feel more confident in how we approach things.
Yeah. It's really, I love that you shared that. And I think it's funny, the longer I live, the more I'm in practice and, in this area, you start to recognize, like, whatever your main complaint is in life, whether it is, whether it is desire and libido and intimacy, whether it is, weight loss or hormones or sleep, it's all going to start with this self-discovery and self-understanding, isn't it? And it's all going to start with this kind of a requirement and commitment of time and practice for a chunk of time so that we can reignite, because the self-discovery takes a little while and then the practice takes a while and then it becomes normal, just like learning any new skill. So does it ever
Yeah.
feel like with this that it's really just about relearning a skill or learning a skill for the first time, like this connection and to intimacy and sex?
I like that you said skill, and I definitely think it is a skill, but I think it's a habit.
Hmm.
It's like we block time in our calendar to, work, or we block time in our calendar to pick up the kids or to, exercise or whatever. But our time with ourselves and our time to fill our cup up is equally as important.
Yeah.
And when we start to prioritize that time with ourselves, however that looks, it becomes a habit. You've just got to continue to do it. And then we learn it like a skill and like a habit and practice it over and over again. And then it just becomes our normal. It's like with communication, it's exactly the same. The more we communicate, get used to communicating about intimacy, about sex, in our relationship, it becomes second nature. But it's that awkward initial feeling of like, this is not, I haven't done this before, I don't feel good about it. And just pushing through that discomfort and going, okay, if I continue to do it, it's not going to feel like this forever. It's going to become our normal.
Yeah, our new normal. We've touched on this, and it's a super obvious question, but I think in the name of empowering women, like, what is the value of having like a great sexual relationship with yourself so that you can, and also with others, if that's in your cards?
Yeah, I think it's what's come through to me is like it's true deep confidence to be ourselves unapologetically and authentically, because this sexual part of ourselves is normal, it's innate, it's within us. And when we can lean into our pleasure and lean into our sensuality and our sexuality, it's so liberating, and it's so connected to who we really are. And it's this confidence, natural confidence that can flow from embracing that part that's just so valuable.
Yeah. And I mean, right, when you're thinking about holistic health, if it is an innate part of us, which it is, like having it to a point where you're happy with it is a requirement for optimal health, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it forms part of the circle of life, That's
Yeah.
how we're here. Where we literally
Yeah, that is
exist for sex. This is a bit that I can't comprehend. Is like, hang on, we don't want to talk about sex, but that's like kind of how we got here,
oh,
right?
yeah. It's a really good point, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the same. It's like we don't talk about perimenopause and hormones and menopause, but without those things, like, yeah, the world wouldn't exist. So it's so fascinating that it's been such a shush topic, sex and
Mhm.
hormones and like the evolution of women. And yeah, it's incredible. This is amazing, Chloe. I so appreciate everything you've shared today. Is there anything else you feel like the women listening should know before I tell them how to find you?
Oh, no, I feel like we covered everything. I
We
think
covered a
there's so
lot.
much to take away. I don't, I'm always so mindful of not overwhelming people, but I just really think it's important if we can start somewhere, maybe what I like to call microdosing pleasure. So
Mm.
like bringing little sparks of pleasure into your day-to-day life is such a beautiful way to allow your body to adjust to what it's like to experience pleasure, because I think so many of us don't aren't used to that feeling of the smallest things giving us goosebumps, or like listening to your favorite song on the radio and like getting that goosebump feeling of pleasure. And the more that we allow our body to experience pleasure outside the bedroom, the more that we give ourselves permission to feel it inside the bedroom.
Yeah, that's such a great point because pleasure really is such an energy source, isn't it? And I think we've kind of fallen into this pocket where many women have, where we're running on cortisol instead of running on like pleasure. And ultimately, that is like the difference between living in a body that's breaking down or living in a body that's building up. So all the orgasm sisters, get out there, get into it, make it happen.
There's no quota. There's no orgasm quota. Go for it.
And go and find Chloe if you need some help with this stuff. Thank you so much for being here. How does everyone come? What's the best place for them to learn more from you? If they want to dive into this juicy part of themselves a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a beautiful place to start, and I understand this is a very sensitive topic. So I love to have conversations on Instagram. By all means, slide into my DMs. You can find me at thehoneyed.official. So reach out on Instagram and start a conversation with me. Nothing's off limits. I would love to hear more about your experience and what you took away from this podcast episode. And then also my website is www.honey-ed.com.
Amazing. I will put all of those in the show notes, sisters. Chloe, thank you so much for being here and for normalizing this topic that should be so pushed out there for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, lovely.
Yes. All right, sisters, go out, fill up that pleasure cup, be more in your life and not just less on a scale. And we'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Period Whisperer podcast. If you liked this episode, take 30 seconds right now to write a review on iTunes and then reach out to me directly on Instagram at Bria_period_whisperer and message me there with a screenshot of your review. As a thank you, I will give you a customized free hormone audit to get you on your way to the best health of your life in midlife.